Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. This is Marcy Reedy, Project Manager here at UCEA with the UCEA webinar series. Today we will be discussing funding opportunities by the Institute of Education Sciences to support research on educational leadership. IES is interested in reviewing applications related to educational leadership as part of their fiscal year 2019 research competitions and has worked with UCEA to spread awareness of this opportunity. As we can all appreciate, government support is vitally important, both to the larger body of educational leadership research, but of course also to the high quality researchers in need of support for their project. Before we get started, we want to be sure we're responding to your concerns and questions about the IES grants. If at any point you have questions or thoughts, please type them into the question box provided through the GoToWebinar platform. We will monitor those questions throughout the webinar and we'll respond to as many as we can at the end, time permitting. So joining us today is Dr. Katina Stapleton. Dr. Stapleton is a program officer at IES and has worked at the Institute for 13 years. In that time, she's seen her share of successful and unsuccessful grant applications. And she has extensive knowledge about the IES grant structure and is just a general great resource for the UCA community. I will mention, if after listening to this presentation this afternoon, you decide to pursue funding, it is strongly suggested that you email Dr. Stapleton a description of your proposed research idea as soon as possible in order to receive specific feedback from her. So without further ado, we would like to thank Dr. Stapleton for joining us today, and we'll turn it over to her. Dr. Stapleton, can you please walk us through what we need to know about the upcoming IES funding opportunities and where Ed Leadership might best qualify?
Sure. Can everyone hear me?
We can hear you.
Can't? Awesome. Okay, so again, I'm Katina Stapleton, and I've been a program officer within the National Center for Education and Research. It seems like for my entire life, but it's really just over 10 years. And I've been the program officer for our education leadership portfolio that entire time. So I am a good resource for those of you who have interest in this area. So the focus of today's webinar, there's three things that I want to happen. The first is to give you an overview of who we are and what we do and how our funding structure is set up more generally. Then I want to walk you through the specific funding opportunities for research on education leaders. Typically, people think that there's only one opportunity, but there's actually multiple opportunities. And then I'd also like to provide you some tips that I think will be helpful. So in front of you is the first and most important resource that you should go to. This is our screenshot, this is a screenshot of our funding page, ies.ed.gov/funding. So I've actually received a number of emails that say, hey, where can I find the request for applications? And the answer is here on this website. So you'll see that on this page we have a set of steps that you should go through to apply for our grant, and especially helpful for new applicants. That's to the left, and then to the right you'll see the list of current funding opportunities. As you click on each of those links, it's going to give you a description of that funding opportunity as well as a link to the full request for application. You can also, in step 3, in the steps to applying, click on that link, request for applications, and that will actually take you to a page that lists all of the current RFAs in one place. So who are we? IES is the independent research arm of the U.S. Department of Education. We were authorized by the Education Sciences Reform Act in 2002. It's important to know that we're nonpartisan, and we are charged with providing rigorous evidence to inform education practice and policy, as well as sharing that information with educators, parents, policymakers, researchers, and the public. So underneath that larger mission, there's sort of three buckets of things that we do. One is describe the condition and progress of education in the United States. The second is to identify education practices that improve academic achievement and access to educational opportunities. And the third is evaluate the effectiveness of federal and other programs. This slide shows the IES infrastructure. And it has a bridge graphic, and this represents how we think about our work. We have this infrastructure that supports our overall mission, and we intend for our work to form a bridge from research to practice and back again, recognizing the critical link between research and practice. So how do we do this? So we provide data that describe how well the U.S. is educating its students. We conduct surveys and sponsor research projects to understand where education needs improvement and how these improvements might be made. We fund development and rigorous testing of new approaches for improving educational outcomes for all students. Again, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we conduct large-scale evaluations of federal education programs and policies. And then lastly, we provide resources to increase use of data and research in education decision-making. So that's the big picture. What does IES do? It's really helpful for applicants to understand how IES is organized. So that's what this graphic represents. We're led by a director. We have a new director, Mark Schneider, and he receives advice and consultation from the National Board of Education Sciences. We have another office that's called the Standards and Review Office. They'll come up again. They're the office that oversees the scientific peer review process for our applications and reports. And then there are 4 centers. The 2 highlighted in blue are our research centers, and then the 2 to the right are the National Center for Education Statistics, which collects and analyzes data related to education, and then NCEE, which does our large-scale evaluations of education programs supported by federal funds. And you also might know them for things like the What Works Clearinghouse and our regional labs. So the 2 research centers, the National Center for Education Research and the National Center for Special Education Research, are very similar. So I like to think of them as sister centers. They're similar both in structure and purpose, which is to fund research that helps to improve student outcomes. The major difference between the 2 centers is population. NCR focuses on students from early childhood to adults, while NICSR focuses on children with or at risk for disabilities from birth to the end of high school. Both NCR and NICSR have core research grant programs that share the following objectives. Those are to develop or identify education interventions, and we broadly define those to include practices, programs, policies, and approaches, etc. And so we want these to be interventions that can actually enhance academic achievement. And it's not enough that they can do it just for a few students. We're looking for things that can be widely deployed across the U.S. We're also doing research to identify what doesn't work, right? So that we can then encourage further innovation and research to find things that do work. And then we're trying to figure out not just what works, we're trying to figure out why it works. so that we can learn and have more successful practices in the future. So IES has supported research on education leadership since 2004. For those of you who've been around a long time, you know that the title of the competitions that support leadership have changed multiple times over the years, but the core of the program is the same. So out of our portfolio, we've had work that develops interventions to improve skill of principals. We've had interventions that look at the relationships between what leaders know and do in student achievement. We've developed and validated successful leadership assessments, and we've also evaluated interventions for school principals. So at present and looking forward, we are interested in receiving applications on the full range of education leaders. One of the myths that I hear a lot is that we only fund research on current principals. That's not actually the case. When we think about education leaders, we're really looking at the full range. So not just principals and assistant or vice principals, we're interested in applications on district level administrators, leadership teams, teacher leaders, school board members, curriculum supervisors, etc. And we are not just looking at people who are currently in this position. We do have limited funding for work for pre-service leaders as well. So let's turn to the request for applications itself. So keep in mind, generally speaking, if you do work on education leadership, we're interested in hearing from you. But there are specific calls that have specific requirements. And we refer to those calls as requests for applications. So requests for applications should be your guide. They include both information about the requirement and information about how to prepare high quality applications. So there'll be both basic requirements as well as suggestions for what you might want to do if you would like to apply successfully. It also includes information about what reviewers are going to receive to evaluate your application. It's a one-stop shop to the application process, as opposed to being two different documents. There's also information in RFA literally about how you apply, so how do you press the button so that we receive your application. One thing to keep in mind is that there are many different applications and they're coming from two different research centers, both of which we refer to as the IES RFAs. So you need to be able to tell the difference between them. One way to do so easily is those numbered .305 are for the National Center for Education Research, and those dots that are marked .324 are for the Special Center. Okay? So again, what do you find in these applications? They are jam-packed with information. They include an overview and general requirements, topic and goal requirements. We'll discuss that a little bit more in a few minutes. They include our competition rules and review criteria, as well as a section that discusses how to prepare your application and how to submit your application to us through grants.gov. In addition, if there's been any changes since the prior year, there'll be a section in the front that explains what those changes were. So there are a lot of RFAs out right now. To the left is a screenshot of the list of current RFAs. As you can see, there are 9 of them. Several of those RFAs include opportunities for research on education leaders, and I'm about to walk you through them. I want you to start with the most obvious. funding opportunities. So as you recall, we've got the two centers. Each of the two centers has what we refer to as our primary request for application. So this is the big deal where most of our grants are funded through. For the National Center for Education Research, ours is called Education Research Grant, and it's 84.305A. NICSER's main request for application is 84.324A, and that's Special Education Research Grant. No matter what RFA you apply to, I suggest that you read these two because I think it gives you a really good overview of what our overall priorities are. Okay? Now, when you're looking at what we're going to call the A RFAs, you're going to have to identify both a topic and a goal. So in front of you right now is a description of the topics that are being competed this year. So you'll see to the left that the Education Research Grants Program has 12 standing topics, and the Special Education Research Grant Programs have 11 standing topics, and some of them mirror each other. For example, you'll see that we both have programs on cognition and student learning, and we both have competitions on social behavioral content. You'll also notice that this year both centers are competing special topics. For NCR, it's foreign language and social studies. For NICSER, it's career and technical education for students with disabilities, English learners with disabilities, and systems involved students with disabilities. It's important to note that each of these topics will have its own requirements. So when you're applying, you have to meet the general requirements for the RFA, plus the requirements for the topic, and the requirements for the goals, which we'll discuss in a minute. Not fulfilling the requirements for either of those things will make your application ineligible for review. So if you have any questions at all about whether or not your application meets the requirements, you should contact the program officer. Okay? So the Education Research RFA has many topics. The most obvious one that you might apply to is the education leadership topic. That's our core topic for research on leaders in the K-12 education system. We've received a lot of interest about leadership at the pre-K level. In that case, you would apply to early learning programs and policies. We receive a lot of inquiries about training principals to improve the social and behavioral environments in schools, so around climate and school discipline and things like that. In that case, you could apply to the leadership topic, or you could apply to social behavioral. We also receive inquiries about leadership at the post-secondary level. So in each case, you would just need to see whether or not your application met that topic's particular requirement. The vast majority of you will probably apply to education leadership, but some of you won't. You'll be able to apply to one of these other topics. More likely than not, wherever you apply, I would still be the person who ended up monitoring you if you received a grant. With a similar setup in special education, within that RFA, we see most of the interest in leaders within the special education policy, finances, and systems topic. Though again, we see people making inquiries in their early childhood topic and in their in their social behavioral topic. So again, as long as you meet topics requirements, you can apply. What is central to all of these topics is that you have to address some sort of student education outcomes. These outcomes are specific to topics. You have to read them very carefully. So they can be school readiness outcomes, academic outcomes, as well as for NICSER, development and functional outcomes that improve educational results and transition to employment or independent living, or higher education for students with disabilities. So one of those will always be a core outcome in this topic. Other topics, some topics allow you to add outcomes. So you'll frequently see people adding social behavioral competencies and employment and earning outcomes, okay? And then again, there are required outcomes per topic. So obviously, if you're applying to the reading topic, they'll require you to have reading outcomes. If you're applying to the leadership topic, you would have to have some sort of outcome actually for leaders, not just student outcomes, okay? All right, so I'm gonna pause and see if we have any questions before we move to goal. Okay, I'll take this now.
We are prepared to move forward, but everyone should be welcoming to enter any questions as we go along.
Awesome. So you want to think of this as a matrix. First, you figure out what am I interested in studying, and that's your topic. Then you want to think of sort of what is the question that I'm trying to answer, and that leads you to picking your goal. So here at IES, we use a goal structure that encourages focused research along a continuum of research that we think is necessary for building a scientific research enterprise. So again, in addition to identifying the topic, you have to identify a goal, which are listed in front of you. Exploration, development and innovation, efficacy and follow-up, replication, efficacy and effectiveness, and measurement. For those of you who are more familiar with our goals, you know that we've made changes to the goals that are numbered 3 and 4. So you would want to pay attention to those. So how have the goals changed? You can move forward. So goal 3 is now focused on initial efficacy evaluations, but it also includes follow-up and retrospective studies. Our effectiveness goal is now focused on replication, and there's different types of replication studies. So let's talk about these a little bit more closely. So the core of the exploration goal is to support the identification of malleable factors associated with student outcomes and or the factors and conditions that mediate or moderate that relationship. Our exploration projects are intended to build and form theoretical foundation for future development of interventions or evaluation of interventions or future development and validation of assessment. So we're looking at relationships in this goal, okay? And there are many methodological approaches that you can use. So here's an example of a funded project. Can you guys still hear me?
We hear you.
Awesome. Okay. So here's an example of a fairly new project with Morgan Donaldson as the principal investigator. As you can see, they're trying to see the relationship between policies that districts have it in place regarding principal evaluation and student. So one thing that you should notice, this is a screenshot from our website, is that for each of our funded projects, we have an abstract that describes what the project is doing. It tells you who the principal investigator is, the goal. At the top under the purpose section, we have a plain language description of the work, and then not pictured on the screenshot, there'll be additional information about the research design, methodologies, etc. on that page. So it is a great resource that you can get to from our webpage. So for the next goal, for development and innovation, we're supporting the development of new interventions, so things from scratch, as well as the further development and modification of existing interventions. Mm-hmm. And we hope that these interventions that are developed are going to provide beneficial impacts to student education outcomes, okay? So the core of the goal is to do development, but while you're doing the development, we expect this to be not just a one-shot where you develop and pilot. We would be hoping that you would have in fact, we require that you have an iterative development process where you get feedback and make improvements and then try again and make more improvements, et cetera, until you have what you think is the solid product, and then you would pilot it. So during this process of development, we're expecting you to be collecting data on feasibility, usability, fidelity of implementation, et cetera.
Dr. Stapleton, would you mind increasing your volume? There are a couple comments saying people were having a little difficulty hearing you.
So hold on one second. Is this better?
I think so.
Okay, great. So we just finished talking about the development goal. So this is our iterative development process. And in addition to doing the initial development work, we expect you to collect data and do a pilot that shows whether or not this has actually some promise of improving student outcomes. So here is an example of a development project that was funded through the Special Ed Center. And I picked this because it's not obvious right offhand that it's related to leadership, but in this case, they're focused on problem-solving teams. And so these are teams that include members of the staff, such as the principal, special education teacher, a school psychologist or counselor, the reading specialist, and a general education teacher. And what they're trying to do is help these teams improve their implementation of evidence-based practices that are targeted to students with disruptive behavior problems or disorders. So in this case, we're not thinking of, the single leader that comes in and saves the day, the principal. We're thinking of this as a leadership team that can improve the outcomes of students. So at our efficacy and follow-up goal, we're supporting the initial evaluation of fully developed educational interventions. And we're also, so we think of these into two groups. One are interventions that already have some prior evidence of promise that they might help students, but we're also interested in evaluations of interventions that have been widely deployed but haven't been rigorously tested. And in either case, we want to know whether or not they produce a beneficial impact on student education outcomes relative to a counterfactual. Usually that's business as usual when they're implemented in schools. And so under this goal, we're doing initial efficacy studies, and we're also funding what we're calling follow-up studies, where you have initial data. Let's say it was on 6th and 7th graders, whether or not the intervention you had for leaders at middle schools, whether or not the effects you saw at that stage actually follows them into high school. Okay? Let's see. An example of that type of project is a currently funded project that's in the social behavioral area. So we're trying to see whether or not the safe and civil school leadership professional development student actually provides and improves student outcomes. In this case, we're trying to determine whether or not schools implementing this intervention, whether their students exhibit fewer disruptive behaviors, and whether or not they have improved academic and engagement and performance. And this is relative to control classrooms. This is a randomized control trial. So in our replication goal, we're funding replication studies under two broad categories: efficacy replications and effectiveness studies. So effectiveness studies are carrying out independent evaluation of fully developed interventions with prior evidence of efficacy. And you're trying to determine whether or not they produce a beneficial impact on student education outcomes relative to the counterfactual when they are implemented by the end user under routine conditions in authentic education settings. Essentially, what we're trying to figure out is, we've already got some initial evidence showing that this works, but maybe that was done under the best conditions. We want to know, if you implement this in a regular school, under regular conditions, will it actually show improvements? So can you replicate the findings under normal circumstances? Under this goal, we're also supporting efficacy replications and reanalysis studies. So what's the difference, people are asking, between this goal and goal 3? So under goal 4, the intervention must already been found to have beneficial impacts on student education outcomes by at least one prior causal impact study, hence its replication. And the research plan must also include a plan to conduct analyses of implementation and factors that moderate and or mediate the impacts of the intervention. So we do not have any projects funded under this goal related to leadership. The next goal is measurement. So here we're funding the development and refinement and validation of assessments, of new assessments rather, and then the validation of existing assessments. So one good example of this is by Jason Grissom at Vanderbilt. And so he is trying to develop and validate a refinement of an existing measure. So the 5D assessment is being transformed into a new measure, which they're then going to validate. Underneath that goal, we have funded the call measure as well as valid. So let's look briefly at the changes from previous applications, previous competitions. So please read the RFA fully, especially if you applied before, because there are shifts. We've talked briefly about the changes to goal 3 and 4. There's new requirements around cost analysis in some goals. There have been revisions to some of the standing and special topics. And then we've added employment and earnings outcomes as potential student outcomes for some topics. And then we have consolidated within NCR all research on pre-kindergarten students to the early learning topic. So you want to make sure, if you've applied before, you attend to that. We've also made additions to our dissemination requirements. We really emphasizing it as something that you have to think of before you even get started on the work. So there's a dissemination plan that's required, and there's new language around our public access requirements. So submitting your information to ERIC, so your peer-reviewed manuscripts. And for some goals, there's also a requirement for a data management plan. All right, so I'm not going to go through this, only to say that each goal has different maximum years and maximum awards, and you should attend to them. If you go over, your application won't be reviewed. The next slide shows the dates when applications are due, which is perilously close, in my opinion, August 23rd for this application cycle. Those of you who missed the letter of intent deadline, don't worry about it. Just send me an email that describes what your project is, and I'll give you some feedback. Okay? And it also shows the possible start dates for the award if made. So let's switch. That was the major section where most of you will apply. Many of you, however, have existing relationships with districts and really think of them as researcher practitioner partnerships. Well, we have funding for that. So we have an RFA, Partnerships and Collaborations focused on programs of practice and policy. So if you look at the number, it's 305, which indicates it belongs to the National Center for Education Research, and it's letter H. So the prior two we discussed were letter A, and this one is letter H. So in this RFA, we're supporting research that's carried about by both a research institution and a U.S. state and local education. And the two groups are working collaboratively on problems or issues that are high priority for the education agency. That's the key. And this research may focus on students within a wide range of educational settings, pre-K to adult, can focus on typically developing students or students with a risk of disabilities, can cover any of those topic areas we discussed before and topic areas we never thought of. This is a topic agnostic RFA. It just needs to be something of interest that's to the LEA or SEA. So under the first topic underneath here, we have the researcher practitioner partnership topic. And underneath that topic, you're carrying out initial research on an education issue or problem of high priority for the LEA or SEA. And in the second topic, for evaluations, you're actually going to carry out an evaluation of a fully developed program or policy that the LEA or SEA is implementing. Okay? You can have more partners than just the research agency in the SCA or LEA, but you have to have those two partners. So some examples. Here is one on exploring academic return on investment as a metric to direct district level funding towards programs that improve student outcomes. So the purpose of this is to help leaders make better decisions that are based on return of investment. And you can see in the description what the partnership is actually addressing. And again, full descriptions of these are on our website. You might ask, how would you find them? You can either go to the website and go to the page that describes researcher to practitioner partnerships. But if that's too difficult, you could actually type that award number in Google, and the first thing that comes up should be a link to this abstract. Here is an example of an evaluation, and that's the evaluation of turning around North Carolina's lowest performing schools. And again, leaders are a main target of this particular intervention. Okay? All right, so similar to the other RFAs, there are different parameters. So there's different lengths and different amounts. These applications are also due for the 23rd. And if you're interested in this, you can first email me, and then I will send your letter on if someone else would be more appropriate for it. So you've picked a topic, you've picked an RFA, perhaps you've decided you're going to submit to A or to H or one of the other. competitions, you've submitted your application. So you're probably thinking, how is my application going to be reviewed? And so we refer to that as the peer review process. There's information about the peer review process in several places. So you can read about it in the request for applications. There's a discussion there. There is also a section of our website. So if you just go to ies.ed.gov funding, you'll see a space at the bottom where there's a link to peer review, and you can read more about this. So when your applications come in, they're first reviewed for compliance and responsiveness. So is it on time? Does it have all the components that are required? Does it meet the topic requirements? Does it meet the goal requirements, etc.? It is very easy for people to miss a requirement. If that happens, your application will not be reviewed. It will actually be screened out during the compliance and responsiveness review. So if you have any questions about that, please contact us. Once it's determined that you're compliant and responsive, it'll be assigned to a panel. We have a number of standing panels: reading and writing, math, science, systems and broad reform, etc. From those panels, 2 to 3 people would be assigned to your application. They would do a deep read of your application and score it based on the criteria that were described in the request for applications. Those that score well enough will go on to a full panel review, which might be anywhere from 10 to 20 people, depending on the panel. Those that did not score well enough will be triaged, meaning the journey would end and you would just receive the reviews from the primary reviewers, but you would no longer be under consideration. People often ask who are peer reviewers. That information is publicly available. You can move the slide forward. So in front of you is a screenshot of our reviewer page. It can be accessed from the main funding website, or you could just type IES Standards and Review in Google, and you should also come to this address. On this site, you'll get an overview again of the entire peer review process, but also lists, our most current list of reviewers. So as you can see right now, we're listing the FY17 reviewers. So here's some advice for you.
Before we get into the advice, we have got a flood of really great questions. Do you mind if we look at some of those that are relevant to the discussion?
Absolutely. I just want to make sure we have time to finish. So we may end up going a little over if people don't mind.
We will have this recording, so if people need to leave, they can come back and visit the rest of it, but we'll try to keep it as concise as possible.
Awesome.
To the heart of the matter, there was a really great question submitted by Rebecca Thiessen that says, could you provide some examples of the student outcomes that are measured besides straight student standardized test scores when applying to the leadership topic? Would also like to she would also like to get a sense for the range of funding that could be granted from a proposal and the length of time. Each proposal, a year, 6 months, 2.
So sure. So for the student outcomes, a lot of them are standardized test scores, but it could be matriculation. So moving from grade to grade, the outcomes have to be appropriate to your intervention. So if you have an intervention that's looking, a social behavioral intervention where you're training principals to improve school climate and reduce discipline problems, then your student outcomes would be maybe around reduction of suspensions. You'll see things like graduation rates. People have used grades. You can create your own assessments. So reviewers often frown on that if they haven't been validated. But for some interventions, the assessments don't exist, and people actually create them as part of their grants. You can have other tests of particular things. So in, for example, early learning, if you were going to have a test of whether or not, I'm trying to see, I don't want to give a branded assessment. Mm-hmm. So if you're trying to assess whether or not student understood simple words, and there was an assessment that was given, so not a standardized test that's reported to the state, but an assessment that you could give in the classroom before and after the intervention, you would do that. So we funded an intervention that looked at teams, leadership teams that are around science and technology use in schools. And so the assessments were around the areas that were being addressed by the science, by the technology. So they were looking at science outcomes, I think. I don't have it in front of me. I hope that answered it. The answer to the money question is it depends. So as we pass those slides, we breeze past them, but it will show you by goal the number of years and the amount of money. So it's really important to know that for the main RFAs, the money is set by goal, not by topic.
Thank you. Another important question that was related to the first one on measuring student outcomes is whether IES funds outcomes for educational leaders themselves, or is all of the grants indirectly related to student outcomes? For instance,
so you have to have a student outcome, and then for each topic you have to have an outcome related to that topic. So if you're applying to the leadership topic, you must, in addition to having student outcomes, have outcomes related to the leadership concept that you're actually measuring and trying to change. So if you're trying to improve leadership knowledge, then you have to have a measure of leadership knowledge. If you're trying to improve leadership behavior, then you have to have a measure of that behavior so that you can show change.
Okay. And if you were trying to retain educational leaders, would that a measure of retention would be?
Yes.
Wow.
That's it exactly.
Okay. Thank you.
So the easiest way to say it is that the measure has to be appropriate to the question that you're actually trying to answer. Okay.
Fantastic. I know that you have some other good advice. Maybe we should move forward on that to make sure we fit it in.
Yeah, because we might answer some of these questions.
Fantastic.
All right. So as I started saying that we receive leadership applications across competitions and across topics. And so that can get a little bit confusing. So I just wanted to give everyone some general advice. So first of all is that you want to ask a question that's important. And so people often ask, what is IES looking for? So one of the ways to think about that is to turn to the RFA. For each topic, we have identified research gaps. This is too small for you to read, but if you were to look within the education leadership topic, you'll see that we've listed specific gaps. These gaps are suggestions only. You can identify some other gap. You just need to make a case in your application that the area that you're researching is important. For people that pick a gap that's identified in the RFA, please do not make the mistake of writing something like this. I'm studying principal turnover because IES said it was important. The reviewers are going to want more than that. They're going to want a solid description of why you think the problem is significant. And saying that IES thought it was significant is not going to be enough. Okay? So as long as your application meets the RFA requirement, you can identify any gap that you like. One good source of information, or rather way to identify gaps, is to pick out what policymakers and practitioners think is important. So here are two screenshots of documents that try to capture that. They're by no means the only documents that do so, but I thought that they were pretty relevant. So one of them is a school leadership, a primer for policymakers that just came out from the Education Commission of the states. And then to the right, you'll see from RAND, a review of student leadership interventions under this Every Student Succeeds Act. And that will show you what evidence already exists for these interventions and what further evidence is needed. Another thing that you want to do in your application is develop a clear logic model or theory of change that show how you got from what principals know and do, or what teachers, leaders know and do, or school boards, etc., to student outcomes. And that's generally speaking a long indirect path, and there is the expectation that you be able to show what that path looks like. This example here is from a funded study where they're showing the indirect pathway from principal leadership to student achievement. And so it includes teacher leadership in an indirect path, as well as a direct path that's independent from teacher leadership. Okay, and so this is from a study that we funded through the education leadership topic. Another thing that you would need to do is build a strong research team. So your application is only going to be as strong as the people implementing it. We can't stress this enough. You're going to get, as part of your review, an evaluation from the reviewers of the strength of your team, but that also sort of bleeds into the rest of the application. We see very few solo applications, and when we do, they're mostly in small dollar amount studies submitted through exploration goal. But in general, you're going to need a team that includes one person for each major component of an application. So if you're going to do a mixed method study that has both qualitative and quantitative research, it's not enough to have a quantitative expert. You have to have a qualitative expert too. So what I might do is put together a list of all the tasks and responsibilities that are implicit in your study, and then make sure you've got a person assigned to each of those things and that they have the qualifications. So in addition to the personnel, we're also looking at the capacity or resources of the institutions that are applying. So please don't use the boilerplate. You want to show that the institution has the capacity to do the work that's proposed. So not that you have a really cool library that has all these books. If you're going to do an exploration study that has 5 large data sets, you want to know that they have the computing capacity, that they have the security to keep the data confidential, etc. They're also looking for, as an institution, does the institution have a record of doing work in that area? Okay, and we're going to want letters from everyone, every partner that's included, and we'll also want letters from schools that are participating or districts. And if you're asking for data from people, we will need things showing that you have access to that data. So here's some things around data and sample that you should attend to. You need to have, again, documentation that you have access to the data sets, especially if it's confidential data. You need to show that you're actually familiar with the data and that it can be used. It is so common to be in a review session and the researcher will, the primary reviewer will say, this application proposes to use X data set to answer this question. And someone will go, that data set can't answer that question. What are they talking about? So you want to make sure that it's clear that the work can be done with the data that you're actually having, okay? You want to make sure you have an appropriate sample. Sometimes people will say, I'm going to recruit 50 schools in the first year, and someone says, no, they won't. There's no way. Maximum, they'll only be able to get 20 schools to agree to this. So you need to have a description of how you're going to recruit the sample that you proposed, okay? And descriptions of how you're going to consent the sample. And then this is a huge thing. Please make sure you're actually ready to apply. So this is kind of a general overview webinar. On our website, we're going to have a webinar specific to the application process. This is crucial if you've never applied before, and I think beneficial even if you have. It's going to go through the nuts and practical bolts of how to submit the application through grants.gov. You want to make sure that you avoid the major trouble spots. They're going to talk about them more in the application process webinar, but some of them I want to point out now. The first one is that the registration process has changed. And so you'll be up for an unpleasant surprise if you wait until a couple days before the application is due and then try to register. You'll also have an unpleasant surprise if you wait to apply within the last, I'd say, hour, sometimes even the same day that it's due, and you find out that maybe your computer won't load the document properly, or you get stuck on the step. That causes people to miss the deadline every year. You'll notice that this says 4:30 and 00. So if it is a single second late as recorded by the grants.gov clock, it will not be accepted. And I'll pause there to let that simmer. It must be there by 4:30 and 00 seconds, as judged by grants.gov's clock, not the clock on your computer. So assuming that you've submitted successfully, you're going to get a series of emails to say, hey, we've got your application, or you'll get some sort of an error email. That's immediately. Later on, you'll get email notification through our applicant notification system that tells you sort of what's happened to your award, where it is in the review process. And then at some point, you'll also get copies of your review or summary statement. Everyone gets them, unless you were triaged. Okay? All right, here's some resources. Please go to our main website, ies.edu.gov/funding, where you will find our portal that has all the information about applying. It's also useful if you look at abstracts of funded projects. Please peruse the education leadership topic to see what's been funded there. But if you have an interest in a particular area, like leadership for reading and writing, you might be beneficial to you to also look at the reading writing topic to see what's been funded there. And we also, on our website, have a number of funding opportunity webinars, some of which will be duplicative of this, but I really recommend that you do the application process one and potentially even the grant writing one. They're on demand, so you can just play them, and there should be a transcript there as well. And we also have resources for researchers online. The best resource is your program officer. Information online is awesome, but you can't ask it questions. So if you have questions, please email me. If I'm not the most appropriate person, then I will connect you with them. For those of you who submitted a letter of intent, you should have already heard from me. If you emailed me during the last week while I was on vacation, I'm still catching up on these emails, but I am responding to each person individually with feedback. So again, if you have questions, you can send them to me by email. And as long as you're willing to hang on for the next few minutes, I can answer questions from those of you that are still online.
Great. We did have a couple good questions that come up. One concern was whether novice researchers were disadvantaged in the application process because of the need for researchers with a CV and a track record, and how that plays off in the evaluation.
I actually took those slides out. So we do discuss that. So yes is my slow answer. But it's somewhere between maybe and yes. It's definitely not true to say that a novice person could come in without any track record and get an IES grant. They're extraordinarily competitive. But it's accurate to say that just because you don't have a track record that's 10 years old or 20 years old doesn't mean you can be funded. What helps is that you are an expert in the particular thing that you can do, and you can show that. For people that we'll call more junior, and we'll say that in track record, not in age, we suggest that for your application, you partner with a more senior researcher who has a longer track record. So this is not a suggestion that they take over your grant and become the PI, though they could if you thought that that was a technique. But you might bring them on as a co-PI, or you might bring on them as a consultant, or you could have a group of more senior researchers on your team as consultants. The more complex the research, the more they're going to be expecting there to be a team. And it is pretty unusual for there to be solo researchers unless you're applying to maybe a methods grant, which we didn't talk about today, or I've seen some exploration studies that were funded that was like really a single researcher with some assistance, but that's, I think, atypical. I hope that helped.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. One other thing. If you bring on an experienced project manager, that also helps. So not only do they want to know that you have the scientific chops, they want to know that you have management experience. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of people will bring on experienced project managers that could show they have experience in making sure the technical details like collecting consent forms actually happen. That's helpful.
Another question, do you have to have an IRB accepted through your institution?
At the time of application, no, but you will before you get your funding.
Mm-hmm. And what about affiliation with a K-12 affiliation, but not an institution of higher ed?
So I'm not sure what the question is.
If a researcher is at a K-12 school or affiliated, but not with an institution of higher ed.
Yeah, so we do get and have funded applications that came from LEAs and SEAs. So I'm going to answer something that they didn't ask, and that's our applications are to institutions, not people.
Mhm.
So if they're applying, it'd be very unlikely if they were applying from Jones Elementary School that they would get a grant. But there's a decent chance if they're applying from Jones School District or the Southern State Education Association that they could get a grant. Because we have funded both districts and state education agencies.
Okay. All right. And is the funding timeline pretty typical? This year's funding timeline, and will there be a new round following the similar guidelines next year?
So generally speaking, yes, though we can never make any promises.
Okay.
We try to keep things as stable as possible so that people know what to expect, but there can always be changes from year to year because our grant funding is dependent on our funding from Congress. So there have been years when the competitions were delayed by many months. There have been years when some competitions just weren't held at all because of funding issues.
Great. And is funding only offered or applications in August?
So different RFAs have different due dates. If you go to ies.ed.gov/funding, you'll see a link to the due dates.
Mm-hmm.
And it'll show you for the RFAs when they're due.
Fantastic. And then finally, there was a question on the percentage of proposals in the overall educational leadership RFA that go to panels for review, and then how many are funded. So is there a
So the exact data I can't tell you, but I can share this. We actually, over the past couple of years, have received very few education leadership applications. And I'm not sure why. We're trying to build up interest. So when you submit to the education leadership topic, you are not just competing with the education leadership topic applicants. Every application submitted to that RFA is treated the same. So remember how we said there was 12 or 13 topics within the education research RFA, and then I think 11 in the special education research RFA. The RFAs are treated as a single entity, and the applications are ranked ordered. So the most, let's see how I want to phrase it. So the best applications are ranked from top to bottom, and then we go down the list. So at the top would be those scored like 1.0 would be outstanding, and then there's a break for excellent, and then there's a break for very good, good, and then I can't remember what's underneath good. It must be something like unsatisfactory. So generally speaking, if you get the score numerically equivalent to very good, you won't be funded. The cut has been around excellent and outstanding. And depending on how much funding we have and the number of high quality applications we received, the barrier or thresholds can become tighter and tighter. So closer to outstanding than excellent.
Okay. Thank you.
So it's extremely competitive. But what I like to tell people is if you give up before you submit, you guarantee that you won't get funded.
Yes. Thank you so much. We have so many great questions coming in, but we also want to be respectful of everyone's time. We are coming up on 10 minutes over. So would recommend getting in touch either with UCEA and with Dr. Stapleton, whose email is on the screen right now, with any questions. We will also attempt to put together a FAQ document and disseminate more information addressing questions that we haven't gotten to today. But we have reached the end of today's webinar on the Institute of Education Sciences funding opportunities for research on educational leadership. I would like to have a sincere thank you, or extend a sincere thank you to Dr. Stapleton for joining us today and offering this wealth of information. And I'd also like to thank all of you who asked such important questions that extended our thinking today. And finally, would like to remind you that if you know someone who could not attend today, or you would like to re-listen to the discussion, a full recording will be available on ucea.org. Thank you so much, everyone. Goodbye and have a pleasant week.